Obviously, this must be a retirement community. No one knows how to work the technology. All you need is a 20-year-old and everything would be working perfectly. So I apologize, at least on my end, for the technical hiccup. I want to thank you, Dad. I want to thank you very much for that wonderful introduction I didn't hear. I assume you said some wonderful things about Mommy and some wonderful things about me in the process also. So thank you. This is really a tremendous opportunity, a tremendous zechus for Mommy's neshama. And it's just a wonderful testimony to really all of your efforts that you put in, not just for Mommy when she was alive, even after now, after she passed, and really all that you do for the community, your Century Village, and everyone there. It really is a tremendous testimony, and you should continue in good health. I may have asked from Shana. After you asked me to speak, you warned me already a few times, probably 8 times, including a few times today, to limit my remarks, to limit my words to 5 minutes. So I give you my word, kibbut av v'aim. You could set your clock, and to the minute, the premier speaker will be able to follow me. So it really is an honor to be able to speak on behalf, or to represent our family, my family, to say a few words about my mother, Imi Morasi, Chayalea Basar Avaron Aleh Shalom. I always viewed it not just as a mere coincidence that she passed away on Shabbos Parshas Chayesara, Chaf Hei Cheshvan, and it wasn't a coincidence. It seemed that the events were somewhat synergistic, because there was so much in common that my mother had with Sarah Imeinu, and specifically the events of this week's Parsha. So you could say that what's the similarity between my mother and Sarah? Well, just a few that comes to mind. My mother had tremendous grace. Anyone who knows her, she had a certain class to her, dignity. If I wanted the violins to play, if I wanted to get emotional, I would say that my mother built a home that was founded on the 3 brachos, which were staples in the home of Sarah and Avraham during Sarah's lifetime. But I want to highlight in particular one similarity between my mother and Sarah Imeinu, and I want to introduce it by way of a question. Rashi in this week's Parsha, in the beginning of the Parsha, when the pasuk says, Shnei Chayei Sarah, these were the years of Sarah, Rashi explains, Kulan Shavin Latova, they were all equal in their goodness. So what was so good about Sarah Imeinu's life? We have a very limited script. The Torah only tells us select details, but from the details that I remember, it really was a challenging life. It really was a life filled with constant hurdles. She had a brother by the name of Lot. I don't have to tell you about some of his misdeeds. She was barren. She actually even lacked the plumbing to have children. She was abducted twice. She finally gave birth at the age of 90, and her biggest concern was that she'd become a laughingstock. She had to face the disparaging remarks and the indignity of her handmaiden Hagar, and then her child Yitzchak was tormented, bullied by his half brother Yishmael. So what is it that was so tov? What was it that was so good about Sarah Imeinu's life? It certainly is not the storybook life that I would want for any of my loved ones. And the answer really is very simple. It's brought down by many different mefarshim, different angles, but all essentially the same. And that answer is that Sarah viewed all of her years and all of the events, all of the circumstances, all of the challenges as good, Litova. Why? How could you possibly say it was Litova? And the answer is easy, because she saw the purpose of her life as the fulfillment of her unique life mission, divine mission. One that was designed specifically for her by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a famous story told about Alan Dershowitz. He taught a course in Harvard called Comparative Religion. And he was one of the lecturers. There were there was a lecturer from the Muslims, the Catholics, so on and so forth. And at the end, for the final, they asked the class to rate God's performance. They asked the class to give God a grade on how well he did in designing this world. And if I remember correctly, God came out with only a B- or maybe a C+. And it's hard to appreciate. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kol Yochol. How did God get anything less than an A+? And the answer really is very simple. Because the problem was that the class didn't understand what it is that God intended to fulfill in this world, what God wanted each one of us to fulfill in our mission. So if you look at the world from, I call it the great adventures, the Six Flags perspective, the fun factor, the glamour, the high points, yeah, God probably does deserve a C+. That probably is an appropriate grade. But if you understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mission, what his purpose was when he put man on this world and threw a whole slew of challenges our way, well, then it makes perfect sense. And I could prove my point. It's not even a hard point to prove. Let's go to baseball. Why is the outfield wall 400 feet from home plate? Why isn't the outfield wall just 20 feet, 30 feet? It would be so easy. You just get up, you hit a home run. Why in football is the whole purpose of the game to have a group, a herd of men, gentlemen, some 6'6", 300 pounds charging, looking to kill you, to rip your head off? If the purpose is to score points, then let me score points. Why are you confronting me? Why are you making life difficult? Why are you putting the outfield wall at 400 feet? And we all know the answer, and that is what makes baseball challenging, what makes it fun, what makes it successful is when you're able to get the ball over the outfield wall, when you're able to go through the defensive line and score a touchdown despite the challenges. And that's what makes someone a Hall of Famer. That's what makes us successful in what we have to do in life. So therefore, if we understand it in life, we should understand it and give HaKadosh Baruch Hu due credit that it's the exact same paradigm, the same model when it comes to spirituality. Life is not easy. It could have been designed as a cakewalk, a life of bliss and blessings, but no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us challenges, but he also gives us the tools and opportunities to rise to those challenges and to overcome them. And that's what made Sarah great, because Sarah understood and she appreciated exactly what her life mission was. She took everything from the same perspective, and that is that she was going to maintain her dignity, her grace, and most importantly, her belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and overcome those challenges. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave her those strengths, which obviously make her Sarah Imeinu. And that's what Rashi meant when he said, Kulan Shavin Latova, because every episode in her life was handcrafted by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? To enable her to perfect her neshama by overcoming these challenges, these difficulties. And that really was the approach of my mother, Aleh Shalom. My mother had a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties, a lot of hurdles in her life. The most obvious was when she suffered from ALS for the last 7 years of her life. And like Sarah Imeinu, she fulfilled her life mission to perfection. Well, what is her life mission? Or better asked, what is every one of our life mission? What's our purpose in this world? So the answer is not really a secret. It's kind of well known. It's out there. You could find it in many different svarim, but for some reason people don't really recognize it or want to recognize it and certainly appreciate it. So what is our life mission? Well, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh tells us that there really are three primary factors, three primary influences that are going to determine a person's challenges in life, as well as the kochos, his abilities to confront and succeed in the face of all of these challenges. What are those three? Well, I'll tell you right off the bat, if everyone would guess and say, well, I nurture my children, I raise them, to be, to be mentioned, to be good Jews. I guide my child properly. I make him write thank you notes, drink his milk. I'll tell you that if it does have any effect, according to the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, it's probably minimal, if at all, maybe 1%, 2%. So what are the primary influences that will affect your life, both the challenges as well as the tools that you have to overcome those challenges? Well, I'm going to skip over the first one. It's a lecture unto itself, and tell you that the second major factor is your name. The name that your parents gave you at birth really determines your life. It really determines almost everything that you will confront in life, and how, or the tools that Hashem has given us to confront those challenges. Your name is going to chart your life course. It's going to chart your mission, as well as tell you how you're going to overcome those challenges. And therefore, let me give you a quick proof. Avram Avinu, what was his name? Avram. Hashem changed it to Avraham. And all of a sudden, he's Avamon Goyim. The whole mission changes. It's a different ball game. And Avram also has different skills that he now has to bring to the plate to overcome these challenges. So what does this have to do with my mother? Chaya Leah Bas Harav Aaron. How does her name, Chaya Leah in particular, really describe her purpose, her mission, and posthumously, how does it tell us how she succeeded, which she did fabulously? So if you allow me, well, let me just go back one moment. When we were sitting down to compose the text on my mother's matzeva, it really was one of the easiest tasks I've ever had. It came so easily, so naturally. It was so obvious that it really just took a few minutes to put together what we as a family collectively thought represented our mother. And if you indulge me, I want to just share the screen for a moment. Let me just show you, if I could only find it now. Here we go. I don't know if everyone could see it. I hope you do, because I don't hear you. So I have no idea whether or not you've heard any of this or see this picture. But this picture now on the screen is a picture of my mother's matzeva, Chaya Leah Bas Harav Aaron. And if you look at
we are not seeing it. We're seeing an appliance receipt about Frigidaire.
There you go.
Dishwasher.
So now you know that I'm over 20 then, because I'm suffering the same challenges.
Just got to find the image and click on it.
Understood. Let me tell you in the interim while I find it. Let me
There
just
it is.
read through it. You see it?
Yeah, you got to pick one. There are 4 now, 4 attachments.
Okay. How's that?
No, you're back to appliances.
There we go.
Okay, there you go. Oh, it's gone.
Is that appliances?
Yeah, appliances, but you got to go back to the other one. You had it for a second.
Understood. Let me indulge me for 1 second, and I will find it. Here we go. How's this?
Okay, you got to pick one. Okay, that's it.
Terrific. So this is the matzeva that we erected for our mother. And if you look at the script, you'll see we spell out, it's an acrostic spelling out her name. Thankfully, her name, Chaya Leah, is only 6 letters. So we were able to fit it all in. But this essentially described my mother's purpose in life and how she overcame those challenges, how she rose to the mission. So for chesed and razulas gumala, my mother loved to do chesed. When she was already suffering from ALS, she insisted on still driving for Bikur Cholim to take other sick people to the hospital. But that was who she was. And she did it in a very quiet, dignified way. She didn't toot her own horn. Yud Yechusa Migdole Torah V'yira. My mother not only is a direct descendant of Tosos Yontif, but her two grandfathers were giants that I could go on for a separate lecture about who they were and how they succeeded in this world. But the real giant in her life was her father, who was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, learned in Yeshivas Chavetz Chaim from the Chavetz Chaim himself, and was, when they came over in 1919, was a member of the first graduating smicha class in YU, was the Rav for his most of his life in New Haven. Really just a tremendous giant, and my mother was so proud of that. Hachnasas orchim, hey, hachnasas orchim tadir kaima. My mother, the house was like the house of Avram and Sarah. It was open from all four sides for anyone and everyone, and giving to the next, giving to not just her family, her community, was really her essence, and she was beloved by everyone. Lamed, which is my favorite, Lilmod v'Lamed Haisa Chukasa. We had company over Shabbos, and when I mentioned that it was my mother's yortzeit, they said, "Tell us a little about your mother." The one thing that always comes out is how much mommy loved not just to learn, but she had a passion for teaching. She had a passion to convey ideas and to discuss knowledge. It was just the defining aspect of her life, and she did it as a teacher and in every setting that she encountered. Aleph Avia Ve'ima Rabos Kibda. She had such tremendous derech eretz, such tremendous kibbud av aim for her parents, loved them dearly. And finally, hey, Hisatzma B'chol Kocha Lavodas Bora. Despite her challenges, she used every moment to always be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, to fulfill her divine mission. She knew what it was, and she fulfilled it to perfection. Yotza Nishmasa B'Nishika. My mother passed away on Shabbos. Shabbos Kodesh Parshas Chayei Sarah. Why Shabbos? Well, Shabbos defined her life. It was the center of her life. Our Shabbos table is the focal point, was the focal point of my parents' home, and therefore it was only fitting that not only did Kodesh Baruch Hu, Hashem took her on Shabbos, but He took her b'neshika, despite all of the challenges, all of the pain that she suffered and she endured in the last few years of her life. Kodesh Baruch Hu, Barachamav, B'chastav, Barachamav, took her b'neshika. Really, just such a quick and painless death. And it was the fitting conclusion to otherwise her perfect life. May her neshama have an aliyah, first and foremost, and may all of us be inspired both by the lives of both Sari Menu and by my mother to always carry out your life divine mission, to carry it out with smile, to carry it out with perfection, to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim in everything we do, and may we always have simchas and have the opportunity to share together. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Hi, Rabbi Kranzler. Would you like to give an introduction, or should I just get started? I'm not hearing you. Okay, I think I'm going to start. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the Kranzler family and to Rabbi Kranzler. It's really it is an honor to be able to be part of this this event. Wait, someone is doing an introduction. Sorry, or not? Unclear to me what's happening. I'm happy to start. Okay. My name is Shuli Mishkin, and I'm a tour guide in Israel. And
Don't see your image. We don't see you.
I'm going to share my screen in 1 second, and I assume you will see it. You'll tell me. Oh, now what happened? Sorry. Catching the bug of people who are not knowing how to use their screen sharing. Okay. Yes. Good. Are we seeing? Okay. Beautiful.
We see good
so,
today, but
hi,
we don't
everybody.
see your image. Okay.
Yes, we're good.
Yep.
Okay, so Rabbi Kranzler asked me what I wanted to talk about. I gave him a lot of different choices, and the truth is this is a very, very appropriate choice, because if we're talking about a yort site that's on Parshas Chayei Sarah, what could be more appropriate than to talk about Hebron? And we're going to add in a little bit about Gush Etzion as well. So this past Shabbos, of course, was Shabbat Hebron, right? Where many, many people go to Hebron to be at the Marat HaMachpelah, because this is the story. This is the week where in the Parsha we hear about the purchase of Marat HaMachpelah, and we're going to take a visit, a virtual visit to Hebron, and at the end a little bit to Gush Etzion itself. So of course in the picture we're seeing the structure around the Mara, which does not go back to the time of Avram, but is about 2,000 years old. And we'll talk about that as we go along. But we want to explore not just the Mara, not just the Cave of the Patriarchs, but also other places in and around Hebron. People who have questions, so happy to hear questions. If you can put them in the chat, that would be wonderful. Okay, so let's understand a little bit where we are, right, when we talk about Hebron and we talk about Gush Etzion. Right, we are talking about the area that is south of Jerusalem. Right, here's Yerushalayim, here's Jerusalem. In the old days, the road went straight through Beit Lechem to Efrat and then to Hebron. Today we have a bypass road that goes around, but the same idea. We're talking about the area that is south of Yerushalayim in the mountains of Yehuda, in Harei Yehuda. Okay, Hebron, of course, is down here. In between Hebron and Beit Lechem is the community of Gush Etzion, right? More modern name is Gush Etzion, but this area of Harei Yehuda, of the mountains of Yehuda, is something that is a place that is so connected to Tanakh, right, and to later time periods by Sheni, right, up until essentially the time period of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Jews leave this area, are forced out of this area and go up to the north. But First Temple times, Second Temple times, this is the heartland, such an important place, and we can think of so many different characters, right? Yishai and David come from Beit Lechem, Boaz and Ruth before them, right? Hebron, the first purchase by a Jew in the land of Israel, right? We have so many connections. Hebron is the city that David begins to rule in. So we have so many connections that take us back to Tanakh and to Jewish history in this area. Just to understand our Shvatim for a minute, okay, if you take a look, you can see, I don't know why I don't have annotate here, but that's okay, right? Take a look at the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Yehuda, down here below Jerusalem, or half of Jerusalem, right? Yehuda is a very, very big tribe. Whenever I travel with people and I say, okay, what tribe are we in? What Shevet would we be in if we went back to First Temple times, if we went back to biblical times? And I always say, if you're anywhere, from Jerusalem on south, Yehuda is a great choice, right? Is a great possibility, because most of it is Yehuda. Yehuda has a huge area that includes kind of 3 different types of land. He has the desert, right, in the east here, Midbar Yehuda. He has the mountains. That's the area we're talking about, Harei Yehuda. And he also has the lowlands, Shvelat Yehuda. Technically, Yehuda also goes all the way to the coast, but the Plishtim come and take his place there. But so many different types of land mean that Yehuda has many, many communities, many, many settlements. He also has a great abundance of produce, right? We hear about the brachot, right? The bracha that Yaakov gives. We have the brachot at the end of Sefer Breshit. And we hear about Yehuda, Osrei Gefen Iro, right? And we hear about Chachlilei Einayim Miyayin Viloven Shinayim Michalav. His eyes are red from wine, right? First, he ties his donkey to a grapevine, right? There's so much grapevines that you can use them to tie your donkey to. His eyes are red from wine, and his teeth are white from milk, right? What that means is that the area of Yehuda is a good area for growing grapes. It's a good area for grazing, so you have goats and sheep, so you can have milk. It's a good area for the three major products that we have, dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar, wheat, wine, and oil. All of those things grow in Yehuda. It's a very, very fertile area. Not only that, but Hebron, Gush Etzion, Beit Lechem, we are all on a major path, that's a major road that's called Derech HaAvot in Hebrew, or in English, the path of the patriarchs. And this is a road that goes back already to Tanakh times, right? If you read these parshas that we're reading now, these weeks, right? And we talk about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and their wives, where are they traveling, right? Avram comes into the land, he's by Elon Moreh and Shechem, he goes down to Beit El, eventually to Beersheba, he goes to Mitzrayim, he goes to Egypt, he comes back, he goes from Beersheba to Jerusalem with the Akedah, with the binding of Isaac, he goes to Hebron, to Beri Sarah, same thing, Yaakov runs away from Beersheba, goes to Beit El, leaves the country, comes back years later, he's traveling along that same mountain road. This is the area that our patriarchs and matriarchs spend their time. This road we still have traces of today, right? We're going to get to Gush Etzion a little bit later, and we're going to talk about this road here. This is the picture on the right here is a Roman milestone on the remains of this ancient road. So this is telling you this is a road from at least 1800 years ago, but it's a much older road than that. So this is the heartland. This is where people are traveling all the time, going back and forth. Jews, at least in Tanakh times, in Second Temple times, are not really living along the coast. They might be traveling there, but they're living in the mountains. They're living in the heartland. Okay, so let's go to Hebron. Okay, in Hebron, we're going to do a few different things. Of course, we're going to go to the Ma'arat, to the Cave of the Patriarchs, all the way over here on the right. Okay, but we are also going to talk about the Jewish cemetery up at the top of the hill. We're going to talk about Tel Rumeida, which is the site of the ancient city of Hebron, the biblical city of Hebron, also up on the hill. This is a flat map. It would be nice if we could see the mountains and the valleys. The ancient city of Hebron was on the top of the hill. The Marat HaMachpelah was at the bottom of the hill. Okay, and we're going to also mention a little bit Beit Hadassah and the Avraham Avinu Shul, which we don't see here on this map, but more or less around here, right? So just to give us an idea of where we are and to give us an idea of a timeline. Don't be scared by this big timeline. But just to have a sense, Hebron is a very, very old city, right? It's around before the time of Abraham, but we know, let's say 1700, give or take, before the Common Era is the time of the patriarchs. Abraham buys Marat HaMachpelah. 700 years later, Hebron is the first place that King David has as his capital before he moved to Yerushalayim. Okay? Second Temple times, we have Herod in the 1st century who builds a monument over the Cave of Machpelah. In the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara, 4th to 7th centuries, you have a lot of Jewish communities in the Hebron Hills. Okay? When the Crusaders come along 1,000 years ago, Jews are exiled from Hebron, but they return with the Muslim conquest. In between, the Rambam, Maimonides, visits Hebron. When the Jews are allowed back into the city, we have an important group of Spanish Jews who build the Avraham Avinu synagogue. In the 19th century, the community grows with Chabad. Right? By the end of the 19th century, Hebron, the Jewish community of Hebron, is growing much greater. We have a Hadassah clinic, right? We have a yeshiva, Yeshivat Slobodka. All of this growth and development comes to a terrible, tragic halt in 1929, when we have terrible Arab riots throughout the land, but the worst of them are in Hebron, terrible massacre, and effectively the end of the Jewish community for the next almost 40 years. Right? 1967, Israel conquers Hebron. Rabbi Levinger and his followers spend Pesach in Hebron. They want to be able to move back in. They are allowed to create Kiryat Arba next door, but it's only in 1980, with the actions of the women of Kiryat Arba, that Jewish settlement is allowed in Hebron. A milestone that is a very terrible milestone, 1994. a Jew, a doctor, Baruch Goldstein, opened fire on Muslim worshippers in Marat HaMachpelah. He was then murdered by the people who were defending the Muslims. He was attacked by the Muslims who were there. And from that point on, the cave was divided between the Jews and the Muslims and only open to all on various occasions. And in 1997, we had the Hebron Agreement, dividing Hebron up into the majority is an Arab area and a smaller Jewish area. And we had terror attacks. Beit Menachem in Tel Rumeida opened, and we could continue, but this I think is enough for us for now. In 1997, Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister then too. This was part of the whole Oslo Accords, giving various places to the Palestinians, but the Jewish community in Hebron very strongly opposed leaving Hebron and giving it over to the Palestinians. They said there will be no access then to the Cave of the Patriarchs, to Marat HaMachpelah. And so this agreement was drawn up where the yellow H1 is 85% of Hebron, and that is Palestinian. Jews are not allowed there. H2 is 15% that's under Israeli control. Only 3% of that is for settlement and visiting, but there's Israeli control in 15%, but you can't go to 15%. All right, but that's what's important to know. If you ever have gone to Hebron or will go to Hebron, you know that as a Jew, certainly as an Israeli citizen, you can only go into certain parts of Hebron, into H2. Right outside of Hebron, north of Hebron, is a place called Anonei Mamre. We've heard about it in the Parsha, not this past week, but 2 weeks ago. This is the place that we have Avram, who has his Baalei Brit, his allies, right? A Narish Kol and Mamre. In Second Temple times, this was an important site, but after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans created a slave market here, and that became such a terrible memory that it lost any kind of importance for Jews. There's a church here from Byzantine times, and there's a tree here because, according to the Christians, this is the Eshel Avraham. This is the tree that Avraham hosted his guests under, and eventually this church was moved to a Russian church on top of the hill called the Moscovia. But let's go back to Hebron. If we want to understand the very beginnings of Hebron, you have to go to the top of the hill. Right? Today, when you go to Hebron, most of the communities, both the Jewish and the Arab, are at the bottom of the hill, not far from Marat HaMachpelah. But and the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery of Hebron, is at the top of the hill. But in biblical times, the people lived at the top of the hill, which makes sense, right? That's where you have a nice view, that's more strategic. And the cemetery was at the bottom of the hill. And that's why Avraham, when he buys the Sader, when he buys the field and the cave from Ephron the Chiti, it's at the bottom of the hill because people are living on the top and they're burying in a different place. Today, you can go to the top of the hill. You can archaeological excavations in Hebron are not so easy to do because it is a very complicated and very divided place. But when a new building, a new Jewish apartment building was built about 20 years ago, Beit Menachem, up at the top, they were able to excavate and they were able to find some amazing things, including the wall of the city, right, from the time that goes back to Avraham, which is fascinating because we know when we read the story, we read the story last Shabbos, we hear about how Avraham buys the cave from Ephron, and who are the witnesses? Kol ba'ei sha'ar iro, all those who came to the gates of the city. So if this is the city wall, the city gate is right nearby, and basically you're standing pretty much where this incredibly historic and important transaction takes place. More recently, there have been other excavations that have been done not so far from here. And one of the things that was discovered, if you see in the picture on the right, this is mikvaot, right? Ritual baths that go back to Second Temple times, which is very exciting because it gives us proof that you had a Jewish community here in Second Temple times. If we were able to excavate with a free hand in Hebron, we would find much more. But meanwhile, little by little, we're finding evidence of a community here 2,000 years ago, of a community here 3,000 years ago. Little by little, facts are emerging from the ground. Not far from Tel Rumeida, at the top of the hill, is the modern Jewish cemetery. I say modern, it goes back at least 400 or 500 years, but modern in the sense that it's not at the bottom of the hill. It's not where the Machpelah, where the cave of the patriarchs is. There are many important rabbis buried in Hebron. You have one here called Rabbi Eliyahu Mani. You see here, we have Rabbi Chizkiah Medini, we have the Chida. People wanted to be buried in Hebron, right? This is a phenomenon. We see it in other places as well, that if someone important is buried somewhere, other people want to be buried there as well. You have this sentence, Li kaver im yishenei Hebron. I want to be buried with the sleepers of Hebron. And so you have many important graves. Hebron's policy, the policy of the cemetery in Hebron, which is a little bit strange, is that they usually did not mark the graves, right? You can see this on the graves here. They were not marked b'shita, right? That was the way they did it. They had very careful records, right? Chevra Kadisha, lists of who was buried where, but they didn't really mark things. Now, to add to that, which could be somewhat confusing in finding things, in 1929, when the Arabs attacked the Jewish community, they came and they destroyed a lot of the cemetery. They desecrated a lot of the cemetery. And later on, when the Jews came back in the 70s, there was a professor, a new immigrant from the former Soviet Union, a physicist. His name was Professor Ben-Zion Tavger, and he took it upon himself to restore the cemetery using these records from the Chevra Kadishas and marking the graves anew. And they also created, and this is what you have on the right, a memorial to the Jews who were murdered in these 1929 riots. Now, a little bit above the cemetery is a special section, and this is the Chabad section. Chabad is interesting. In the early 1800s, the Chabad, the Lubavitch community, comes and strengthens the community in Hebron. They build their own synagogue. One of the most important figures from Chabad in Hebron is a woman named Menucha Rachel Slonim. You can see her very visited grave over here on the right. She was the daughter of the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. She was the granddaughter of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. In 1845, she and her husband moved to Hebron, and they basically becomes like the bubby of the whole community. Everybody came to her for advice and for blessings, not only Jews, by the way, Arabs as well. She was a very powerful force in the community, and her family, the Slonim family, was very, very important in Hebron. Unfortunately, many of them murdered in 1929. Her grave in the Chabad section was almost given over to the Arabs in this Hebron agreement because it's not in the cemetery proper, it's in a separate part, but Chabad put a lot of pressure on the Israeli government, and it stayed within Jewish Hebron, and you can go and visit it today, and it's a very significant site for many people to come visit. The modern story of the cemetery, after Jews returned in the Six-Day War to Hebron, the government did not allow them to live in Hebron. We'll get to that story in a moment. And not only were they not allowed to move into Hebron, they were not allowed to bury their dead in Hebron. And this changed with a very courageous woman named Sarah Nachshon. In 1975, Sarah Nachshon, who was one of those first settlers, she and her husband Baruch Nachshon, he's a famous artist, and they were one of those first settlers in Kiryat Arba. Unfortunately, she had a child who died as an infant. They named him Avraham. And she wanted to bury him in Hebron. She said, I want to go back to our ancestral homeland, to Hebron, and I want to bury my child in the cemetery in Hebron. And she marched into Hebron, which at that time was basically under military rule with Israeli soldiers. And they said, you can't come here. You can't bury your child here. This is not allowed. And she said, I have my child here. I have my dead child. Are you going to refuse a bereaved mother an opportunity to bury her child? And they couldn't, and they let her through. And she buried him. And she says, she said very famously, Avraham bought Hebron with the burial of his wife Sarah. I, Sarah, buy back Hebron for the Jews with the burial of my son Abraham. So it's a very powerful, almost disturbing, but very important story. And with that, the Jews returned to the Jewish cemetery in Hebron. Somewhat of a lighter story. There was a Jew in Morocco. His name was Avraham Aboutboul. He was born in Morocco in 1876. He lived in Morocco, and in 1910, he was a young man, so 30s, in his 30s, and a representative from the Jewish community of Hebron came to fundraise in Morocco, in his town. This is in 1910. Hebron is starting to really become an important Jewish community. And he says, listen, you're a young man. Ad Me'av Esrim, there's a skula for you that to have a long life, you should buy a grave in the Jewish community of Hebron. And then, after 120 years, you can be buried in Hebron. So he does. He gives money to support the Jewish community. He buys himself a grave. Eventually, Avraham Aboutboul makes Aliyah. When does he make Aliyah? When does he move to Israel? In 1963. 1963, Hebron is in the hands of the Jordanians. You can't use that cemetery. Oh, well, money is gone. But the joke is on, I don't know who the joke is on, but Avraham Aboutboul lived to 1983. Okay, when he died, he was 107 years old. And 1983, the cemetery in Hebron was in Jewish hands again, and he was actually buried there. Another place that's important in the city is a synagogue called Avraham Avinu Synagogue. Very, very beautiful synagogue down at the bottom. Okay, this is when things switch, when Jews move from living at the top to living at the bottom. This is the Jewish quarter of Hebron in the 16th century, bought by somebody named Rabbi Malkiel Ashkenazi. These are Jews who are the expellees from Spain, right? We have many Jews who are expelled from Spain who make their way to the Ottoman Empire, some of them to Tzfat, some of them to Hebron, and they build this very beautiful Beit Knesset, Avraham Avinu Synagogue. Why is it called Avraham Avinu? Besides the obvious reason that we're in Hebron. The story is told that one Yom Kippur, there was a terrible plague in the city. Not too many people were around. Either people died or they ran away from the plague. And night of Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, the Jews who are left in the city gather to pray in the Beit Knesset, but they look around and sadly there's only 9 men. They don't know what to do. There's Yom Kippur, they have to pray, and they look around, they're getting very despairing, and suddenly some mysterious old man walks into shul. Will you be with us for Yom Kippur? Yes. And he's with them through the night, the day, up until Ne'ilah. As they're getting ready to finish davening, each one is arguing, I want to take the stranger home for, to break the fast. I want to take the stranger home. And when they finally finish and they blow the shofar and they look around, the stranger is gone, right? Now, usually those stories are told about about Eliyahu. Here, because we're in Hebron, the story is told about Avraham Avinu. This beautiful shul, which is really beautiful if you go to Hebron, very worth visiting, was also destroyed by the Arabs in 1929, and our same Ben Zion Tavger, who helped to restore the Jewish cemetery, actually restored the Avraham Avinu Synagogue, and today it's back in its beautiful condition. In the late 19th, early 20th century, Jewish Hebron expands. Okay? The Slobodka Yeshiva comes here. There's a building that's built, this beautiful building on the right here is called Beit Hadassah. It's first built just as a building, but eventually Hadassah, which is the women's organization that helps to improve healthcare in Eretz Yisrael, they create a health clinic here, and the city is growing and expanding. And then the disaster strikes. August 24th, 1929, the Muslims have all these rumors that the Jews are about to attack on Har HaBayit, all of them very false. The British, of course, are in charge here, and there are terrible massacres all over the land of Israel. We're going to see this in Gush Etzion in a few minutes, but also in Jerusalem and also in Tzfat and also so many different places. But the very, very worst ones are in Hebron, where the graves are desecrated, the shuls are desecrated, but most importantly, 69 Jews are killed. This was exceedingly upsetting, obviously, on many levels, but on one of the levels was that the Jews felt that they had good relations with their Arab neighbors, and it all kind of fell apart. Many took refuge in the home of Eliezer Slonim, right, from that same Slonim family we talked about before, who was very respected by the Arabs. The Arab attackers, the rioters, came to the house. They said, if you give us the Ashkenazi Jews, we'll let you spare the Sephardi Jews. Of course, he refused. And they were all murdered, and it was very, very horrific. The British do very little. Is a proclamation from the High Commissioner, John Chancellor, talking about how regretful and terrible it was, but they didn't do very much to actually stop it while it was happening. The picture on the left is of the Avraham Avinu synagogue in its desecration. And essentially, this is the end of the Jewish community in Hebron, even though it takes until 1948 for it, in the War of Independence, to become part of Jordan. The Jewish community pretty much picks up and leaves. It's not a place that can have a viable Jewish life at this point. We want to jump ahead to the Six-Day War. Hebron is one of the places that was conquered in the Six-Day War, of course, along with all of Yudan and Shomron of Judea and Samaria. But Israel did not make any quick decisions about allowing settlement there, allowing Jews to return there. As we're going to see, the only place where they really do say that is, well, in Jerusalem, of course, but also in Gush Etzion. But in Hebron, the idea was, we want a bargaining chip. Who knows? Maybe the Arabs will make peace with us, right? All these things that turned out to be illusions, but we're not allowing Jews to return to Hebron. There were many Jews who were very unhappy about this, because here we are, allowed finally to come back to places that are so holy to us. How can we not move there? And one of the people who was very involved in getting Jews back into Hebron is this gentleman here, Moshe Levinger, who Pesach of 1968, right, less than a year after the Six-Day War, rents out an Arab hotel in Hebron, ostensibly to make Pesach in Hebron. Fine, they come, they kasher the kitchens, they move in, but when Pesach is over, they don't leave. And basically, they present an ultimatum to the government and say, we're not going anywhere. So, you either allow us to live here, or figure out some other way to keep us safe, but we're not leaving. A lot of back and forth between the army, the government, and the Jews who were in the hotel, with the ultimate decision being that they couldn't settle in Hebron, but they could build a community right next door, the community that became known as Kiryat Arba, right? In Tanakh, in Sefer Breshit, we know Kiryat Arba hi Hebron. It's the same place. But today, there are two places. There's the Jewish community of Kiryat Arba, and then there's the larger town of Hebron, which has Jews and Arabs. And they settle in Kiryat Arba. But in 1979, the women of Kiryat Arba say, this is not what we wanted. We want to be in Hebron proper. They pick themselves up and they move into Beit Hadassah, right? Remember Beit Hadassah over here, right? They move into Beit Hadassah, women and children. And the government is kind of in a bad position, because they can't leave them unprotected, but they refuse to leave. And so there's a standoff. And basically the women say, listen, we're not leaving. And the government says, okay, we'll protect you, but you can't leave. You can't go out to go to the doctor. You can't go out to visit your husbands. You can't go out at all. And they agree to these very, very difficult conditions. This is not a simple thing. And there's no modern living conditions, to say the least, in Beit Hadassah, but they stick it out. And what happens is that there were yeshiva students who would come from Kiryat Arba every Friday night to do Kabbalat Shabbat for the women, to pray outside and to make Kiddush. And there was an attack on these yeshiva students in 1980. 6 yeshiva students were murdered. By this point, it's 1980. Menachem Begin is in power. And he says, now I'll allow settlement in Hebron. And that's the very beginnings of Jewish settlement in Hebron. Eventually, we have settlement not only in Beit Hadassah, but also in the Avraham Avinu neighborhood, also in Tel Rumeda up on top. Today in Hebron, we have, give or take, about 800 Jews, maybe 1,000 Jews. The numbers are always tricky to determine, as opposed to many, many Arabs. Just want to check back my numbers, right? Approximately 160,000 Arabs. So very, very unbalanced numbers. Let's go to Me'arat HaMachpelah to talk about that a little bit. Okay. So today, first of all, you can see the building on the top. This is a building that is, as far as we know, built by Herod. Why do we say this? Because if you look at it, you can see that the style of it looks very much like the Kotel, right? It looks very much like the walls around Har HaBayit. We don't have anything written, whether in Josephus, right, the Jewish historian of the Second Temple times, or in our sources, in the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Medrash, that Herod built this, but it seems to be very much his style. Today, when you go to visit Ma'arat HaMachpelah, today meaning after 1994, the Ma'ara is divided, and that's what the picture I brought you here on the bottom. The staircase is where the Jews go up. On the other side of this gate is where the Muslims go in. When the Jews go in, you have the two smaller rooms, the Avram and Sarah room, the Yitzchak and Leah room. The Muslims have the larger room, Ulam Yitzchak. They do not see each other. They do not mix. 10 days a year, including Parshat Chayei Sarah, the entire cave is given over only to Jews, right? So Chayei Sarah, Yom Kippur, a few days of Chol Moed, Sukkot, and Pesach, right? 10 other days of the year, the entire cave is given over to Muslims, right? On important Muslim holidays. So there is a very much a separation today. Who's buried in the cave, right? So we, of course, know from our parsha that Sarah is buried, and at the end of Parshat Chayei Sarah, we hear about Avraham being buried. We have a medrash that talks about Adam and Chava being buried, that there are actually 4 couples here, right? Not only the 3 that Sefer Bereshit tells us about, Abraham and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah, not Rachel, of course, she's buried in Kever Rachel. The medrash adds Adam and Chava, okay? And we have this grave. None of these are graves, right? Whoever's buried is buried deep underneath the ground. These are what are called iyun kever, or a cenotaph. It's a stone monument that's meant to signify that there's a grave below. There's another one on the outside as you're making your way in. And you can see, if you can see the writing here on the bottom, this is the tomb of the prophet Joseph, right? According to the Muslims, who, of course, the Ma'ara is holy to them as well, Yosef is buried here. According to Jews, of course, that's not true, right? Because we know the story about Yosef, who tells the Jews, tells the tribes that, you know, when you're finally getting out of Egypt, right? You're going to take my bones with you when you finally get out of Egypt. And we hear about Moshe getting the bones, and we hear in Sefer Yoshua about them being buried in Shechem, right? So Yosef is not buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. What's the Jewish tradition about this other extra grave? We say it's Esav's head. Okay, the Medrash has a great story about Esav and Hushim ben Dan and Naphtali's son, and cutting off Esav's head. But the main graves here, of course, are of the fathers and the mothers. Ulam Yitzchak, which is the one that's off limits to Jews most of the time, although sometimes you can get in to see it and it's really phenomenal, is this big, big, beautiful room. People who were in the Ma'ara before 1994 will remember going in here. But today, most of the time, it functions as a mosque, right? Because obviously, the Muslims hold Ma'arat HaMachpelah to be holy to them too. They do not see this as Ulam Yitzchak, right? Who's holy for them? Avraham, right? Avraham is one of the major prophets. Avraham, as we know, had 2 sons, Yitzchak, who is our ancestor, and Ishmael, who the Muslims see as their ancestor. So they think of this as Ulam Ishmael, not as Ulam Yitzchak, but it certainly is very important and very holy to them. Can we know what's underneath, right? Can we know anything about the actual graves? Because as we said, the building is from 2,000 years ago. The stone markers are maybe from 1,000 years ago. Whatever graves there are deep underneath the ground. By the way, this is one of the reasons, one of the suggestions, not everybody agrees, but that Kohanim can enter Ma'arat HaMachpelah. The other is, these are tzaddikim, and graves of tzaddikim do not make you tameh, right? Very interesting questions. But what's underneath? So when Jews were able to come back after the 6-day war, okay, you couldn't do excavations, right? You can't dig up a place like this, but they found an opening, a small opening that was very small, was only large enough for a 12-year-old girl right? Somebody very small. And they found a very brave 12-year-old girl named Michal. You have to remember, this is 1968. This is before you had cell phone cameras or anything else. And she went down with a flashlight and she explored, and you can go down, and she found a long corridor with a room, and then down on the bottom, a cave within a cave, which is fascinating because what does Rashi say about the Machpelah, right? He takes the word kefel, double. He says two things, double, it could be couples, right? Men and women, double. But double, he also says, is a cave within a cave, right? So that's fabulous to be able to see that. In 1980, there was another attempt to go down under a larger opening, which you can see up here. And the same thing, right? They found some graves that go back 1,500 years. They found this cave within a cave, right? A very, very interesting thing. I'm sorry, my video for some reason is being very strange. I don't know why. I'm sorry. I hope that's not bothering anybody too much. Let's try and fix it for a second. No. All right. I don't know if that's bothering anyone. What is this in the chat? Oh, you're seeing this fine? Okay, good. By me not, but it's okay. You can see the screen, and that's what's important. Okay. One more thing about the graves. What does it mean? What are these graves? What did graves look like in the time of Avraham and Sarah? So we have Yaakov, right? Yaakov is talking to Yosef, and he says to him, don't Okay. All right. Am I all right? Are you hearing me now? Let me know. Yes, no, maybe. Not hearing me? Yes. Okay. Excellent. Sorry. Never play around with something that's working. Okay. So graves in the time of Abraham, right, are so back to Yaakov, right? Yaakov says, "Come, don't bury me in Egypt. Take me back to Eretz Canaan. But kever asher kariti li, the grave I have dug for myself." But the word in Hebrew is kariti, like a michra, like a tunnel, right? And we have found many graves that go back to the time of the Avot, and they're called shaft graves. They're about 4 to 6 feet deep, with the person being buried essentially standing up, right? And we've actually found graves like this outside of Me'arat HaMachpelah, which is fascinating because it tells us that we have graves that go back to the time of the Avot, right, in the style of the Avot. Okay, one more little piece in Hebron, and then we're going to spend the last amount of our time in Gush Etzion. As we said before, the Mara is holy to everybody, right? Abraham is seen as the ancestor of Jews, of Christians, of Muslims, right? If you follow a little bit of politics, you know that recently Israel signed the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates, right? With alluding to the fact that we have one father, right? A common father, Abraham. And so the cave has been fought over for millennia, basically, right? If Jews controlled it in the beginning, when the Crusaders come, the Christians come, they kick out the Muslims and the Jews. And when the Mamluks kick out the Crusaders, they kick out the Jews as well. And for exactly 700 years, Jews were not allowed inside the cave, right? From 1267, Jews had to pray outside on what's called the seventh step. And that's what you see over here, this little sign here. Jews were not allowed into the cave, and they prayed outside. And that's why today, if you go to the cave, people obviously will go inside because they're able to, but there are still people who will pray outside on the seventh step because for so many centuries, Jews did pray there, and there's a holiness to a place that people have prayed in for so long. let's spend the rest of our time taking a little bit of a look at Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion is close to my heart because I live here. I live in Alon Shvut. Gush Etzion today is the communities that are south of Beit Lechem, including Neve Daniel, Elazar, Efrat, Kfar Etzion, Bat Ayin, but also including on the east here, Tekoa, Nokdim, Kfar Eldad. We are going to talk about the West and the 4 communities that were here before 1948, and also about the return. Okay, so this area, which wasn't called Gush Etzion, that's a modern name, right? But it was called Harei Yehuda, was really a center of Jewish life in First Temple times, in Second Temple times. We have evidence of a lot of small Jewish communities here. We have, going back to our story of Derech HaAvot, right, of the path of the patriarchs, on that ancient road, we found big, beautiful mikvaot, right? Why ritual baths? Why mikvahs? Because people would do a pilgrimage. People would make Aliyah LaRegel, pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And in order to go to Jerusalem, you had to be pure, you had to be tahor. So you had mikvaot on the way. We have aqueducts, that's the picture here on the bottom, bringing water to Jerusalem. There's not enough water in Jerusalem. In Second Temple times, you had many people living there, many visitors. So you brought water in aqueducts that were dug out by Herod from the area of Gush Etzion to Jerusalem. In the eastern side of Gush Etzion, you have Herod's magnificent palace called the Herodian. So this was a very, very important place in First Temple times and Second Temple times. But what happened was that with the defeat of the Jews in the Bar Kokhba revolt, the 2nd century of the Common Era, basically Jewish life in Yehuda was decimated, was finished, and Jews moved to the north, to the Galil, to the Golan, and the area of Yehuda was basically empty of Jews. When Jews started to return to the land with Zionism in the late 1800s, they at first did not return to the mountains, right? They did not return to Harei Yehuda. Why? Because they returned to the places that the Arabs were willing to sell them land, which was the swampy land not far from the coast or along the coast, the swampy lands of the Jezreel Valley. Nobody was really thinking about the mountains of Yehuda. But in the 1920s, there's a first attempt to come back here. There's a community called Migdal Eder, attacked and destroyed in the 1929 riots. In the 1930s, we have another attempt, right? There's a company called El Hahar. It's founded by this gentleman over here, Shmuel Holtzman, who was a very interesting businessman. He traveled all over the world. He had gold mines in Australia, and he decided he's going to create communities here. He buys some land. By the way, this name, Gush Etzion, has nothing to do with Zion, right? It has to do with the fact that Shmuel Holtzman, a Holtz means a tree in German and Yiddish. So it's Mr. Holtzman's land, Etzion, a tree, the block of settlements belonging to Mr. Tree Guy. That's basically what it means. But again, the land is, the communities are attacked in the riots in 1936. But in the 1940s, the third attempt, 4 communities are founded: Kfar Etzion, Ein Surim, Masuot, Yitzchak, and Revadim. The first 3 are religious. The fourth is secular, Shomer HaTzair, obviously very, very Zionist. And they come out here and they start to build and they start to create. Many of the settlers who come out to these communities of Gush Etzion are survivors. Right, this is happening in the 1940s. Jews who managed to get out during the war, who managed to get out after the war. There are a lot of survivors who come here to start their lives all over again. Sometimes they're the last of their family. And this is a very significant part of their story, that they've survived what happened in Nazi Europe, and they're not leaving. They're setting down roots here. And we have this beautiful, it's called Megillat HaNeti'ah, the scroll of planting, right? When they plant trees in Kfar Etzion, right around the time of Tu B'Shvat in 1944, listen to what they write here: on the 26th of Shvat, 5704, 1944, in the 5th year of the Second World War, a year after our ascent to Kfar Etzion, we, the members of Kvutzat Avraham of the Poel Mizrachi, approached to plant fruit and forest trees in Kfar Etzion to fulfill what is written in the Torah. And when you come to the land, you will plant. The earth was not created for chaos, but to be settled, right? So of course we have to settle here, but listen to what what they say next. At the time when the rivers of our brothers' blood are spilled like water and the world is drowning in blood, we came here to build and plant and strike deep roots in the mountains of Judah. With these plantings, we open a door to our redemption and salvation. We were rootless in the exile, and that rootlessness was a terrible disease of our nation while in a strange land. We need roots. We need to have a strong hold in our homeland. That is the work that we are doing in this place. So you can understand that they are not going to leave so quickly. They've been uprooted from their homes in Europe, from their families. They've come here, and this is where they're going to stay. And when the United Nations in November 29th, 1947, votes on what's called partition, right, to divide the land up into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Jewish state is the blue, the Arab is the orange. Gush Etzion over here falls within the confines of the Arab state. And the question that the four communities have to decide is, well, should they stay? The War of Independence breaks out the next day, or should they evacuate to Jerusalem and help the fight from Jerusalem? And they have bitter arguments about it. They stay, right? War breaks out. The Gush becomes very cut off, very difficult to reach, hostile territory, surrounded by Arab villages, as well as the large Arab cities of Beit Lechem and Hebron. Very hard to get supplies to here. And they have to make a very difficult decision of staying behind or not. In January, the children and most of the mothers are taken out of the Gush and they are brought to Jerusalem. They're actually housed for a time. What you're seeing here is a convent and a monastery that is in Rehavia. It's called the Ratisbon Monastery, and they actually took in the children and the mothers of Kfar Etzion. The men, the single women, and a few mothers stayed behind to fight. And what we're going to see, unfortunately, is that many of these children became orphans with the aftermath of what happened in Gush Etzion. They stay, they fight. 3 of the communities fall in the beginning of May 1948. On May 13th, okay, the 4th of Iyar, the day before the declaration of the state, Kfar Etzion is the only one of the communities still standing, surrounded by Arabs. They hold out, they hold out, they hold out until finally they can't hold out anymore. They surrender. The Arabs tell them to come out to take a picture of them, and then they massacre them. It is a very, very horrific story. Very few survive from Kfar Etzion, and the children mostly become orphans. They become very, very connected to each other. The Battle of Gush Etzion is the battle where more women are killed than any other battle in 1948. 27 women are killed. The picture that you're seeing here, if you go today to Kfar Etzion, there's a very, very powerful movie that's been created about this story. This is the bunker of the building of what's called the German monastery, which is where the wounded were put, and grenades were thrown in there. It was a very, very horrific ending to the story. And this was a story that stayed on in Israel's memory for a very, very long time, still is today. The fact that it was the day before independence was declared, if you know a little about how things work in Israel, you know that the day before Independence Day is Memorial Day. Nothing like American Memorial Day. Very, very somber, very, very serious day where we remember our fallen soldiers and people who were killed in terror attacks. Part of the reason we have Memorial Day literally the day before Independence Day, which is a very difficult juxtaposition, is because of the fall of Kfar Etzion, is because of this devastating attack and so many people who were killed, and so many children who were left orphans. The fallen are taken out of Gush Etzion and brought to Mount Herzl. Ben-Gurion himself praises them as protecting the road to Jerusalem. From 48 to 67, this whole area is off limits to Jews. It's under the auspices of Jordan. And the one thing that can be seen in the distance, right, from Israeli-controlled land is a big, old, beautiful oak tree called the Lone Tree or the Lone Oak, the Alon HaBoded. And this was where the children of Kfar Etzion would go. They would go to a hilltop where they could actually see this tree. It was the only kind of landmark on the landscape, and they would remember. They would remember what had happened, and hope to one day come back. After the 6-Day War, right, in the 6-Day War, one of the major battles of the 6-Day War, the Battle of Ammunition Hill, one of the children of Kfar Etzion, whose name was Meir Schnur, was killed in the Battle of Ammunition Hill. When his friends, when all of the other children of Kfar Etzion get together to remember him 30 days later on his Shloshim, by this point, Gush Etzion has been reclaimed, has been redeemed, and they petition the government to be allowed to return, and they are really the first ones who are allowed to return. They come back to Kfar Etzion. Very soon after, from Kfar Etzion, another community is founded called Alon Shvut, the Tree of Return. It's founded because what's founded there is the yeshiva of Har Etzion. One of the major people involved in helping to create it is someone named Hanan Porat alav shalom, who was one of the children of Kfar Etzion and fought very much to be able to return to the Gush. Today, the tree, right? Remember the tree, right? The tree is the symbol of Gush Etzion. You could see it on the buses. Around the tree is a memorial site that remembers these original 4 communities. Of the original 4 communities, only one, Kfar Etzion, has been rebuilt in the same place. And the other 3 were immediately rebuilt in other places already in 1948, 1949. Kfar Etzion was the only one that wasn't built somewhere else because there were very few whole families that were left after this terrible massacre and disaster. So today, Kfar Etzion has been rebuilt in the same place, but there are many other communities that have joined it. And today, Gush Etzion is a vibrant Jewish community, educational institutions, yeshivot for men and women, tourist attractions, and lots of kids. So that is our look a little bit at Gush Etzion. I don't know if people have questions, have comments. We want to go back to Rabbi Kranzler, please. Thank you. Do you want to finish up? Do you want to end the Zoom? Thank you, everyone. I don't know if Rabbi Kranzler wants to. Yes, okay. The rabbi is closing up. Fine. Good. I will mute myself.
You're still on mute. Dad, you're still on mute. You need to unmute. You need to unmute.
Still not working, Dad. Can't hear you.